So we have the pleasure to have with us for the concluding part of our talks, Lorenz Keyßer from ETH. Maybe you can explain better than me what you do for your research and your current affiliation. Let me just share with you an anecdote. So actually, Lorenz and I have never met, but we know each other quite well because in 2019 we were traveling overland to different parts of the world. Lorenz traveled from Europe to Australia without taking a plane, and I was traveling from Europe to Japan without taking a plane. And so we, in a way, exchanged information on Twitter, and that was in 2019. Then COVID came about, but yeah, so we can see that Lorenz is also animated by this passion for the environment. And yeah, so we would really like to learn more from Lorenz about degrowth. So as you know, you might know, Lorenz, that Scientist Rebellion, so this international group of researchers and activists that practice civil disobedience, not today, but normally practice civil disobedience as a way to really show the gravity and the seriousness of the climate crisis. So we really endorse, and we have made the degrowth one of really important aspects of our agenda. So probably there are many things on which we might not agree, but degrowth is really one of the things that put us together. So you have a very hard job, because in 30 minutes we would like you to give us an overview of degrowth, more from the more, if you like, material aspects, but also maybe more the philosophical aspects. But I don't want to constrain yourself too much. You've already been very kind to accepting our invitation just 2 days ago. So I'm going to change the position of the laptop so that you can see the audience here, hopefully. And so it's been a long day. So at least you can see some of us. It's been a long day, so some people have already left. So we are just in front of the Bonn conference on climate change. So there are delegates who are getting out now. And yeah, maybe they still have a chance to listen to your talk. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Gianluca, for the very kind introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm very thankful for the invitation. Yes, I will now share my screen so you can see my presentation. 1 second. So now you should be able to see my presentation.
Yes.
Cool. So yes, my task today is to talk to you about degrowth and socio-ecological transformations. And here I will look more specifically on barriers to such a transformation and possible ways to overcome those and move forward. I have structured the presentation in 4 parts. Now, before I talk a little bit to my background, I have published a little bit on degrowth. Below are 2 of the, I think, most important citations on which I mostly base also this presentation. And I try to give you an overview about degrowth, but also at some points, because it is such a huge field, I mean, I can't, of course, give you like a complete overview in such a short time, so I try to focus on different aspects and at some points also give more my perspective on it, of course. But I will say this at those moments. So I've structured this in 4 parts. The first is just to give you like a definition, a short overview what degrowth is, and what it can contain as a more concrete vision for a sustainable and just society. Then I will go more into detail to explain why I think degrowth is necessary and desirable, and also, of course, how it's referenced in the literature. And then I will go more into barriers to degrowth, why it's so difficult to pursue such a transformation, and then some strategies how to move forward. Okay, so what is degrowth? It's many things. I if you look in the literature, you find it described as an umbrella term for different concepts, a theory, a paradigm, also a social movement, a critique of current society, or a utopia towards which we should move, or also a societal and scientific project, and is also a slogan. So there are all those different aspects which come together under the word degrowth, which makes it also so versatile and with so many facets and perspectives which are very hard to summarize in short slides. So yeah, this is like an encouragement to look further into this and also look at the aspects which interest you the most, be it scientific research or social movement applications. Roughly, we can look at 3 dimensions of degrowth definitions following Timothy Parik's PhD thesis. First is an emancipation from something like the destructive institutions and ideologies which are currently dominant, such as the economic growth paradigm, productivism, consumerism, and capitalism. But it's also including a destination where we should emancipate ourselves towards, such as a society based on well-being, sustainability, justice, democracy, and mutual cooperation. And it also includes this decline, right? If you think of degrowth, most people think of some decline of some sort. And this is aimed at ecologically unsustainable activities, for instance, connected to our currently very high energy and material consumption, which is in turn coupled to GDP as gross domestic product, the measure of economic growth. If we put all those aspects, dimensions together, we can arrive at like a more comprehensive definition, of which I propose something here, so you have all of these things together. So degrowth can be defined as an equitable and participatory social transformation, which would be aspect 1, which ensures sustainability and well-being for all beings, also non-human, independent from economic growth, which is aspect 2, the destination, and which results in the stringent reduction of energy and material use in the global north and connected environmental damages, which would be the decline in aspect 3. And in this transformation, GDP is very likely to decline, which needs to be prepared for. So this is relatively abstract, which is tried to make more clear here in this figure, which comes from Wiedmann et al. We are currently in this overconsumption, environmentally unsustainable area, or also in poverty and need, which is socially unsustainable, and we want in this sort of donut, right, from Kate Raworth, sustainable lifestyles, a safe and just space for humanity. But what does this mean more concretely? I put together some points from the literature. This is just to give you a short view on this. It's, of course, cannot be comprehensive. So it can mean we have much more direct democracy, for instance, in workplaces and neighborhood assemblies, where we reduce working hours, we have more time for recreation, community engagement, care work, and political work. So this time wealth aspect. We have a form of open relocalization, which means that although we have more local production and consumption, this doesn't mean that communities shut off from the world and do their own thing, completely isolated, but there should also be connected to more freedom of movement, exchange, etc. Mobility is a big issue. Car-free cities can be considered. Extensive, comfortable public transport, much reduced aviation, and slow, high-distance travel, as Gianluca and I have experimented with. And fifth, production of open source, long-lasting, repairable products, and less resource-intensive industry. And as a result, this sort of would mean much reduced energy consumption, for instance, through retrofitting houses and also smaller living spaces, and also, of course, 100% renewable energy. So these are just some points to make it maybe more tangible. So why is degrowth necessary and desirable? I start here from sort of the scientific literature as summarized by the IPCC. How do mainstream climate scenarios reach climate targets? And this is maybe a good point to start from there. So by far most of the scenarios, and all from the established integrated assessment models, the big climate models, they maintain economic growth measured in GDP, but they compensate for that through massive negative emissions. This is shown in the area below the curve here, marked in red. So soaking carbon out of the air, very strong energy efficiency gains, and a very fast and large-scale expansion of low carbon and renewable energy. And of course, not all scenarios rely on each aspect to the same degree, but it's usually a combination of the three to compensate for that increased strong economic growth. And all those aspects, the massive negative emissions and energy efficiency gains and fast expansion of renewables, those are connected to side effects, uncertainties, and effects on the global south, for instance. So these can be questioned on these grounds. And also this is sort of in contrast to historical data, which is shown here. I know it's a very complex graph, but the important takeaway here is that you have different countries in different groups. For instance, recent peak countries which have reduced emissions only starting in around 2008, 2009. Long-term peak countries which have reduced over a longer period of time. And Eastern countries, the Eastern European countries, which have reduced following the crash of the Soviet Union. And what you see on the left side is the distribution of the CO2 reduction rates since the peak years. And on the right side, you see those reduction rates for every year since the peak year. And the key point here is that if you look at when countries start to reduce emissions substantially, like in the 4% range, as shown in dark blue here, this coincides with economic recession in the year 2008, 2009, or also with the crash of the Soviet Union. And those reduction rates are still far away from the 1.5 rates with 50% probability, or also the 2 degrees rates. But if you look at the countries who have reduced over the longer term, those in the middle, you notice that these rates are abysmally small, even smaller than the 2 degrees warming with 50% possibilities. So historically, strong reductions in carbon emissions have coincided with sort of recessions, and even then sort of remained insufficient. So this can be summarized in this graph, which is from a paper which Manfred Lenzen and I published, which I linked at the beginning, which basically shows where degrowth is situated compared to mainstream integrated assessment scenarios. And this is a relatively complex graph, so I spent some more time here. On the y-axis, you see the mean annual increase of renewable energy. So going up is a higher speed of renewable energy expansion every year. On the x-axis is the energy GDP decoupling, so basically how high energy efficiency gains are. And the size of the bubble is the amount of negative emissions and carbon removal cumulative until 2100. And on the left side here, in the lower corner, the black dots are historical data plotted in rolling 10-year averages for those variables. And now we have all kinds of different scenarios we looked at in the paper. But what's important is that those scenarios here on the right side, those are scenarios which maintain normal rates of economic growth. Especially the blue dots here, those are like the 4 archetype scenarios in the special report on 1.5 degrees. And what you can see here is that the further you go away from the historical data, you can argue that the higher are the risks or the uncertainties associated with reaching those scenarios, right? Like it would need very high energy efficiency gains, very high negative emissions, and very high renewable energy expansion compared to what we have experienced if we go to the left here. And compared to those mainstream scenarios, the degrowth scenarios here are much closer to the historical data, although we also modeled negative emissions, of course. But yeah, it's much closer. But they are comparably strongly under-researched and given less attention. Okay, so in this perspective, degrowth minimizes these key risks, right? Which is a strong reason, I think, to pursue it. Of course, climate change is not the only problem. We have an ecological crisis, which goes much further beyond that. I can't really focus on that. Here again, the aspect of climate injustice, climate justice, which you certainly know about, these effects and causes are strongly unequally distributed, as the IPCC report said that 3.3 to 3.6 billion people live in contexts highly vulnerable to climate change. And if we take this into account, this climate injustice, the case for degrowth gets much stronger, because the mitigation responsibility in the global north substantially increases up to rates which are far beyond anything experienced so far. And it also calls into question the reliance on large-scale renewable energy transition and negative emissions, as they both strongly affect the most affected in the global south via the land areas required, the mining activities required, which are very often in those already marginalized areas. So the consequence of this is we need degrowth in the global north. And this is what is shown here, basically, also from our paper. We modeled the current, this is the current average per capita final energy consumption here for 2017 for the global north in orange and global south in blue. And you see like the huge disproportionality here. And then now two scenarios here. One of our degrowth scenarios, where globally aggregate final energy consumption declines, and here a moderate scenario where global energy consumption increases even. But even in the increased scenario, when you account for equity, there's more or less distributed equally. There will be differences for climate reasons, for instance, in terms of the energy needed. But it's a huge decline for the global north on average already for such a growth scenario. And in a degrowth scenario, much more. Those horizontal lines here are from a paper by Millward Hopkins et al. They modeled decent living energy thresholds under different assumptions. So this is basically the energy required for a decent living standard, including good healthcare, housing, etc., which is just to show you that even in the degrowth scenario here, we could meet those decent living energy standards relatively comfortably for 10 billion people until 2050. This is the key assumption. Okay, degrowth is also desirable if we look at well-being data, and this plots on the top life satisfaction and on the bottom life expectancy, plotted against GDP per capita and carbon footprint per capita for two time periods, 2005 to 2007 and 2013 to 2015. And what you see here, the key takeaway is this is all like a root function, so it has declining marginal returns, which means that the countries on the far right here with very high carbon footprints and very high GDP per capita, they could quite comfortably reduce on these axes and still maintain high life satisfaction and high life expectancy, especially if you take into account, of course, the necessary structural changes which would need to facilitate that. But even in today's sort of connections, you could do that without like massive reductions in life quality. Cool. Here I just showed you some modeling examples which already model degrowth in more detail. You are encouraged to check them out if this interests you. I can't go into detail in every one of this, but just to show you that the aspects I just talked about, they are like already implemented in some of these models, and yeah, yield quite supportive conclusions, I think, which is why I put this here. Cool. Now to barriers to degrowth. Why if the reasons are so strong to pursue degrowth, why aren't we doing it? And I think this has many reasons why we can't just stop growing. And one key reason of this is that currently well-being is strongly coupled to growth, because if we stop growing or even just reduce growth, then the risk is very strong of an economic crisis, an economic recession, or even depression if it lasts longer. And this is, of course, socially completely unsustainable. And this is because of growth imperatives, which is a key concept here. And I follow here the definition of Richters and Simonite, which define them as exterior conditions that make it necessary for an agent, such as an individual, workers, firm, or a state, to increase the economic efforts as to avoid existential consequences. And economic efforts need to be defined depending on the agent in question. Okay, so this is an open research field. I would like to emphasize with lots of different theories as well as proposals on those growth imperatives. So there's still a lot of conflict here. This is just to show you a bit of this variety. It's also from the paper just mentioned. On the y-axis is sort of the level, the state, firm, households, and on the x-axis the degree of social pressure, whether it's coercion or free will. And you have examples here of growth imperatives, like it's just an ideology, it's a matter of taste, people just want growth, no? Or there's a grow or die imperative in the economy, or like the systemic stability depends on growth, which is a coercive mechanism. What kind of growth imperatives exist in our papers? We argue that growth imperatives are inherent to capitalism as a historically specific but currently dominant socioeconomic system. And of course, other authors debate this heavily. But I would here define, of course, capitalism as a system where monetary exchange dominates social reproduction, including labor power, resources, and finance, where workplace hierarchies between workers and capitalists exist, and which are enforced by states, and firms face more or less strong competition. So this is, I think, not really a super strong marker of capitalism. And production is motivated by the expectation of profits. So returns over costs, basically. And we argue that economic growth is a systemic outcome of these social structures. How does this look like in more detail for capitalists or firms and states and workers and individuals? I go step by step here. This can mean that capitalists have a lot of power. They can fire workers when profit expectations shrink. They can depress wages. They can move production, and also their finance to different jurisdictions and countries. They have a lot of ways to influence politics, media, culture, etc. So yeah, that's one big problem. If, for instance, you want to reduce working times, for instance, cooperatives would be more likely to do that than if you have capitalist-owned firms. Then you have competition between firms, which need to minimize costs through economies of scale, innovate and advertise in order to increase profits, to be more secure, to also isolate themselves against economic crisis and insecurities, which overall yield the effect that with more money and if you're richer, bigger, you better withstand crises and uncertainties. States also, I would argue, have growth imperatives. They are dependent on tax revenues and low unemployment, which in turn depends on healthy private investments, let's call it that way. And when they're also in competition with other states militarily, politically, and economically. And all of this results in states fostering growth and also strongly economies of scale as the ideal sort of aggregate capitalist. So, for instance, they keep energy prices low in order to facilitate accumulation. But workers can also be argued to face growth imperatives. They face structural barriers to reduce their consumption, for instance, unsuitable options for employment, only full-time employment, for instance, or only far away, so that they need to have a car, for instance, to get to work. Housing opportunities, transport options, and also information, that people lack information to make more ethical decisions. But there's also positional consumption as a key mechanism, where people show social status by consuming rare goods. And this is sort of a key mechanism in capitalism, because money is sort of the guarantor to access to those positional goods, because they are rare, they're expensive, right? And this guarantees you a high social status. Then there's efficiency consumption, where workers compete against each other in labor markets. So if you don't have access to a car, for instance, oftentimes you're at a disadvantage because you can't take certain working contracts, or you have longer times to work, which is a bigger strain on you if you still want to have a healthy non-work life, let's call it that way. Is degrowth feasible though? Now something went wrong here. One can argue, and I said, Kali said earlier, that currently abandoning economic growth seems politically completely impossible, because if we want to decouple well-being from economic growth and overcome these growth imperatives I've outlined, this implies very deep challenges to socioeconomic power structures and the accompanying conflicts, right? However, it's very important to keep in mind that political feasibility can change with better knowledge, more awareness, and strengthened social movements. So the balance of power really can change if we build up the counterpower to those institutions, growth-driving and growth-dependent institutions. Again, can we fight poverty while expanding desirable sectors such as healthcare, renewable energy? I think here is a human needs perspective really important, because it emphasizes that these are things of prioritization. Do we want these things as a society to be expanded, to be fought? And this is mediated again by power structures. So we need to talk about those power structures and less about whether we lack the means to do these things. So what do we do now? How can we deal with these barriers? There are some policy proposals, of course. There are many of these. Here I just give you some examples. For instance, a key part of degrowth policy proposals is to have a more progressive tax system, wealth tax, for instance, high inheritance taxes to strongly decrease inequality. We also argue strongly for a reduction in wage labor. Working hours can be reduced to say 25-30 hours a week, and decentralized and renewable energy sources exist as commons. Other examples include universal basic services, which mean that basic human needs are provided for, housing, food, health, etc. They are no longer traded on markets. Production and distribution are arranged through democratic processes. Is one idea. This is connected to a democratic economy. Economic decision-making and investments are democratized. Production is focused on creating long-lasting, sustainable products, and production is organized democratically. So, how can we reach those reforms? I think this is the key part and needs much more attention. The pathways, how to reach this, and I focus here on 3 overarching pathways of change, and I think there are more and different foci, but I always find these 3 quite useful. And I structure them along 2 axes. One, whether the pathway sees the changes as being compatible with capitalism or incompatible with capitalism, and what the role of the state is Should we focus a lot on taking state power, for instance, through parties, getting parties in power, different politicians, or should we not focus on taking state power? And the first one I call reformism, or also radical reformism. This is the pathway which focuses on changing cultural values, for instance, through transition initiatives, also grassroots movements. But ultimately, these are thought to inspire policy change through bringing different parties into parliament, which implement those reforms. And this is sort of, just working with current institutions and working within current institutions. A different pathway I call hierarchical economic democracy, and usually you could also call this state eco-socialism, which focuses a lot on the state as a sort of transitional actor, and this focus more on very sort of strongly invasive measures, for instance, price controls, rationing, public ownership of state ownership of certain industries, these sort of things. And this is thought to be incompatible with capitalism. And the last one I call horizontal economic democracy, or you could also call this libertarian eco-socialism or eco-anarchism. And this one views the state sort of as part of the problem and focuses on building a outer parliamentary counterpower via organizing of neighborhood assemblies, disobedient grassroots movements, etc., to pressure the state basically from the outside to implement reforms. Like how could this inspire the categories or a more concrete theory of change? This is a bit more my perspective now on what we should be doing or could be doing. And I focus here on agents, who is supposed to push for these changes, and also what categories of change should we focus on and how do they interact. Firstly, it's important to say that all the actions and strategies should be context and also partly location specific. So there's no one size fits all. I think that's very important to emphasize, because if you only look at the abstract level, this often, is under complex. Who is to drive change? I would argue the primary driving actor must be, or is, a horizontal outer parliamentary movement of movements across oppressed groups. This includes, for instance, workers, the unemployed, youth, and also indigenous people, also the feminist movement, anti-racist movements. These sort of movements need to work much more together because they have shared goals of social justice, and together can create a very effective counterpower to the groups in power. The first category is called alternatives, or the interstitial transformation, following Eric Olin Wright's categories. And this focus more on building a different world in the here and now, providing alternative institutions to the current systems. And so it's really important, I think, to build horizontal and federated counter-institutions. This can include unions, horizontal unions. Of course, established unions also have a lot of problems, especially also in Germany. But also here we should try to push for more radical perspectives within the unions. Cooperatives and neighborhood assemblies, and these form a network of mutual support, which also helps to support disobedient action, because you don't need to be as afraid of backlash and losing your job, etc., if you have those networks in the back. The job of these is not only to educate, but also to practically show that alternative ways of living can be possible and are desirable in the here and now. So I think there's nothing as convincing as if you show people with a living example that things can be different, and that this world is not the only one possible. Then, of course, reforms and the symbiotic transformation, sort of together with established institutions, still remains important. But the question is, how do we achieve reforms? And I think this is crucial because I think a point can be made that historically the most effective way to pressure the state to implement reforms is via direct action, which then push for reforms, the non-reformist reforms, which in turn devolve more power to counter institutions and to the grassroots movement. This can include, for instance, the universal basic income, working time reductions, also stronger taxes and these sort of things to give power back to people. And I would argue there's always a risk of co-optation of social movements which strongly engage with institutional politics. So I think it's on the safer side and also more effective if one stays autonomous from and minimizes involvement in institutional politics. One can remain more unpleasant, more disobedient if one stays outside. This does not mean to not cooperate at all. I think that's still important if you have sympathetic individuals in the halls of power. That's a good thing. But one should not rely on them to implement radical measures. Lastly, I think it's super crucial to emphasize the opposition and ruptural transformation because in degrowth discourse this often gets lost, I feel. So it's important to oppose destructive development and also defend against backlash, also via direct action and a diversity of tactics. Yeah, I think this can include everything from occupations to ecotage, to a lot of different strategies, depending on the context and situation. So that's the conclusion. Basically, we need to get organized, and yeah, I think that's it from my side. Sorry for taking a bit too long. Thanks very much. And these are two Twitter handles. You can follow me, and I'm also part of Degrowth Switzerland, an organization pursuing degrowth and post-growth ideas in Switzerland. Cool.
It wasn't easy to provide a comprehensive view over degrowth, not only on, let's say, the theory, but also how to implement it, barriers. So I think, yeah, we're really, really grateful. I think you did a brilliant job. I don't know if there are questions from the audience. We're already running late and we are a bit tired, but please.
Extinction Rebellion in Switzerland is a prominent actor in this respect. How does this connect with degrowth goals? Is this a goal for XR Switzerland?
I don't know if it is a question for Lorenz or for some XR. Have you heard the question, Lorenz?
So the question is, what's the connection between Extinction Rebellion in Switzerland
yes.
and whether they adopt a strong degrowth position?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not super familiar with Extinction Rebellion in Switzerland. I think they do important work, but so far I don't know whether they have explicitly or strongly adopted a degrowth position. Yeah, I don't know this, but yeah, I think they do important work. In terms of yeah, the civil disobedience they are doing. Yeah, I don't think I can say much more on this question. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe I have another question that yeah, would be grateful if you could answer briefly. So yeah, I wonder the extent to which, I mean, we know that in a way, democracy is in crisis. So more and more people say, for instance, that they don't care if a strong man, because most of the time it's a man, a strong man leads the country without caring for parliament and democracy. So this was one question of the World Value Survey that is being asked internationally. And the share of people who answer yes to this question, so it's a good thing to have a political leader who doesn't care about the parliament and the institutions, is a good thing, is growing in Europe, but also in the United States. The share of people saying yes is at the same level as Russia. So we are observing this dissatisfaction, and I was wondering the extent to which degrowth can be a force to capture this resentment with the system of people from the general public, and many times by lowly educated and low-income people, into something that is more constructive.
Thanks for this very good question. I think, I mean, of course, that's a very complex question, and I don't think I can give a super satisfying answer, but I will try. I think degrowth can, in so far, give a good answer to this, as it, I think, points out that there are massive changes necessary to what we understand also as democracy, I think, and degrowth is also described as often like a collective self-limitation, and I'm not sure whether this process will happen under the banner of degrowth, because I think it's often gets misunderstood, or it's maybe not the most let's say the best concept to get like a mass effect on people, but I think it can strongly inspire social movements which are strongly connected to those issues. For instance, the labor movement, workers' movement, feminist movement, anti-racist movements. And I think these movements can strongly connect to the worries people have and the dissatisfaction people feel, and try to channel this dissatisfaction with established institutions into a willingness of radical progressive change, because currently the right is much more effective in targeting those dissatisfied, disengaged people. The political right, and I think to give an alternative to these far-right groups is extremely important. But this again, I think, includes also to give an alternative in terms of political organizing and how democracy can look like and work like to people. And I think here the idea of like horizontal grassroots movements, which also work counter to the main institutions, is an important one, because I think people do feel that oftentimes, or most of the times, their interests are not taken care of in institutional politics, even if you vote for rather left or progressive parties. If you look at Germany, who introduced the Agenda 2010, it was the Social Democrat and Green Party. So I think, this can be an important avenue for social movements to channel this dissatisfaction into more progressive routes. I think the Yellow Vests in France, zum Beispiel, were an example which had many progressive elements actually, and quite radical elements, but was often like portrayed as a regressive movement. So I think this shows the possibilities also what we can